Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima and Dylan of economicsjunkie.com and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas both ancient and modern in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode 16, Why Minsky Matters, part 2. Hello, Dylan.
Hello, Nima. How you doing?
Pretty good. So we are going to continue reading from Randall Wray's Why Minsky Matters. And I ended at chapter 3 last time, so I wanted to continue with a quote from actually I ended at the end of chapter 2 basically, so we're getting into chapter 3 now, which is called Minsky's early contributions to the Minsky's earliest contributions to the financial instability hypothesis.
Before you get into that, can you give me and everybody else a reminder when Minsky was, and a quick background recap?
Yeah, Minsky was an American economist at the University of Chicago for quite a while, and towards the end of his life, he was a professor at Berkeley, and his biggest contributions were sort of in the 80s, such as stabilizing an unstable economy, but he had been writing before that as well. He even wrote all the way into the 90s. He died in 96, I believe, so right during the Clinton era. And I think shortly before he died, he actually predicted that his entire theory predicts that budget surpluses and starving the private sector of net savings leads to instability and artificial booms and crises. So this book is a lot about, this is what Minsky already wrote about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and now we're sort of seeing it come to fruition.
Right.
So, quoting, "It is not surprising that Minsky would have been concerned about business cycles, since he had come of age during the Great Depression, whereas most modern macroeconomics sees cycles as resulting from shocks or policy mistakes. Minsky believed that they are created by the internal dynamics of the economic system. To put it another way, mainstream economists believe that market forces are naturally stabilizing. There is some disagreement over the quickness with which markets can restore equilibrium, but there is the notion that if we waited long enough, free markets would eventually get the economy to full employment after some external shock causes a recession. In Minsky's view, this is precisely wrong. Market forces are destabilizing and must be constrained to create stability. However, there is no permanent solution to the problem of cycles because stability is destabilizing. Markets will subvert the constraints and create instability that eventually results in yet another recession. For Minsky, the greatest threat to stability is the boom, because it encourages the risky behavior that ultimately leads to the crash. As he put it, the biggest danger is not a tendency to stagnation, but rather the tendency to explosive growth that eventually crashes." So once again here, stability is destabilizing. So the more rosy our predictions become, the better our economy looks, the more profitable companies are, the more we earn, the more we get promotions, whatever, the better things look, the more unstable the economy becomes at the same time.
Right, because the less we believe that it's actually going to end.
Exactly. The less we believe it's going to end, the more we believe that we can just borrow and spend. And if the market conditions are such, or that rather the institutional conditions are such that economic boom leads to a balanced budget because tax receipts rise, which generally tends to be the case in progressive taxation systems, then unfortunately the boom becomes unstable. Once the private sector runs out of liquidity, aka net private savings, then they will start cutting down, and then the whole house of cards comes crashing down.
Sorry, were you still going on your point, or
No, go ahead.
I had three people come to mind when you read that passage, and the first one is Adam Smith, actually, and his invisible hand. Right. Because what you read from there was most mainstream economists, and I guess this is inclusive of particularly of Austrian economists of the libertarian variety, say that the free market...
They aren't even really mainstream. They're heterodox, yet they also cling to this neoclassical idea of the...
that the free markets are stabilizing.
Yes.
And as we learned from reading David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where he very clearly detailed that Adam Smith, when he came up with the idea of the invisible hand, and the invisible hand is essentially what we just said, that the free market is naturally stabilizing, is that Adam Smith was trying to come up with an economic corollary to what Isaac Newton was coming up with in physics, which is that there's this universal force that governs matter and the way things move. And because all these guys were deists, this actually took on religious significance to them.
Right.
So the invisible hand, the idea that the free market is naturally stabilizing in its most original sense, is actually a religious idea.
Yeah, you can say that.
I know that sounds bizarre.
Yeah. And it's true. I mean, I also discussed this in our in the previous Minsky piece, that Harvard economists and other other economists that were not part of the institutional school in Chicago, where Minsky was, they always tried to explain the economy with charts, and they had these perfect charts and market clearing prices. And Minsky discusses that there's really no evidence that that is the case. There's no evidence that free markets always clear the market, for example. That there's such an invisible hand that creates full employment. Because Minsky just looked at the institutions and the actors at hand. And it was very empirical. Companies produce what they can, or companies sell what they can sell at a profit. And that's their primary goal. They don't have a primary goal that is, I'm going to clear the market, I'm going to create full employment.
Right.
And there's no indirect process by which we get to that situation either, according to Minsky. And worse yet, even if we did, then, as we just discussed, stability is destabilizing, and we're back to, starting a boom and that'll cause a recession ultimately.
I don't remember if it was Warren Mosler who told us this in one of our interviews with him, or I heard it from somewhere else, but he mentioned a similar thing, which is that the private sector always wants to expand. It just always wants to expand. Yeah. And honestly, as someone running my own business now, I completely agree. I'm always looking to expand.
Yeah.
And furthermore, my goal isn't to employ everybody.
Right.
And I mean, obviously, nobody's claiming that individual companies are to employ everybody, but my incentive isn't to employ everybody either. My incentive is toward the profit.
Right.
So if I have to choose between my profit and employing more people, obviously, I'm going to be incentivized to do the profit. Now, naturally, of course, people have moral considerations on how they feel on these things, and they're going to decide via that. But at the end of the day, I have to earn a profit, or else I just go out of business.
Right. And the big chasm, I think, between Minsky and Smith is that Smith believed, or all his offshoots believe, that this profit motive indirectly leads to full employment. And that is a leap of faith. That is not empirical, is Minsky's point.
Well, and then, I mean, it comes back to what we've talked about before, the assumption of the barter theory of money.
Exactly.
Where if the state is actually the thing causing the unemployment.
Right.
Which, to re-emphasize that if you happen to be bumping into this episode and haven't heard us talking about this for the first time, according to modern money theory, which is what we're ascribing to here, the state creates unemployment by imposing a tax, right? To be employed means you're earning money to be employed means you're working to earn the unit of account, and the unit of account is the thing that you pay your taxes in.
Correct.
So the state creates the problem. It's not a free market problem that you are or aren't unemployed. It's a state-created problem, so there has to be a state-provided solution.
Exactly. And that is the job guarantee, which we also, or the transition job, rather, that we also covered in one of our earlier Amagi
previous episode. And I got one more person.
Yeah.
Which is Carol Quigley.
Yes.
To bring up.
Yes.
So we've been talking a lot of Carol Quigley the last few episodes, going over the Evolution of Civilizations miniseries. And what you said about Minsky, or what you read that Randall Wray said about Minsky, is that the booms caused the busts because people naturally start engaging in more and more risky behavior because they feel more confident. I feel like this is very similar to Quigley's explanation of the instrument of expansion in the Evolution of Civilizations, in that people get accustomed to the expansion.
Exactly.
And they can actually become accustomed to it through generations or even centuries. And if a bust hits and the expansion slows down or even starts retracting, people get wildly depressed and anxious and irrational. And as we went over, there's a whole list of bad things that happen to people when this occurs. But it's interesting to note a lot of that has to do with the expectation of growth.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you just mentioned, you yourself have become accustomed to. We have become accustomed to expansion because that's the regime that we grew up in. We're so used to it. Like me too. When I ran a business, I always wanted to grow. I always wanted to have more customers, more clients, a better infrastructure, more efficiency, growth. That's just how it works, and that's what we've become accustomed to. But it doesn't have to be that way, as we've also discussed. So moving on here, on page 75, the first serious test of the strength of the financial system came in 1966 in the municipal bond market, and the second in 1970 with a run on commercial paper. Additional tests came afterward: commercial paper in 1970, Franklin National in 1974, and so on. But each was resolved through prompt central bank action. Thus, although the early post-war period was a good example of a conditionally coherent financial system with little private debt and a huge inherited stock of federal debt from World War II, profit-seeking innovations would gradually render the institutional constraints less binding. Financial crises would become more frequent and more severe, challenging the ability of authorities to prevent it being another great crash, from happening again. The apparent stability would promote instability. So just here, I just want to point out what he mentions here is very important, because it's also something we've talked about. The government deficit induces very safe assets into the economy. and that creates a stock of safe assets that can allow the system to grow pretty safely for a while, until whatever the political conditions become such that the government tries to balance the budget, and that those the austerity talking points become more prevalent, all because of political choices, not because of other economic necessity or anything like that.
Can you expand a little more on the safe? What was the term that you used?
Assets?
That the government injects into the safe assets that the government injects into the economy, as opposed to which risky assets?
Yeah, so the safe asset are government bonds of any duration and bank reserves that, if you add them all up together, they constitute the private sector's net saving. And that is as opposed to private debt, which is debt that someone has, or money that someone borrowed at a bank, or money that someone has raised on the stock market. Those are more risky types of debt that the borrower actually has to repay, and there's a default risk. But the government, there's no default risk if it's a sovereign issuer of the currency, because it can always create the currency.
So why don't the government bonds need to be paid back?
Well, because they do have to be repaid, but they're not repaid. But there's no limitation on the part of the issuer of the bonds to have access to money to repay those.
Because they created it.
Created, yeah. It all starts with them imposing a tax and then spending money into existence that people need because they need to pay the tax. The entire system is upside down. If you haven't listened to our previous episodes on this, then I suggest listening to episode 1, and because that's exactly what we talk about.
Yes, it is exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, I'll stop asking so many basic questions and just keep.
No.
I guess we should refer to episode 1 more.
I was talking to our audience, really. If this is new to them, then that would be a great source to start with.
Yeah, and I won't. I don't want to take the time to explain it, but I do want to at least
reference it. Yeah.
Address it. Is that when we're talking about the private sector net savings and the fact that the government is injecting money, and the government assets are the private sector net savings, which are separate from money that's created by the banks or money that's created within the private sector. Banks, in quotes, being the private sector. We've discussed before. They're quasi private public monsters. If this is the first time that you've heard us or anybody talk about the subject like this, and it sounds completely bizarre, we understand. As Nima mentioned, we have broken down these ideas very meticulously in actually our original episodes. Started episode 1, and we went over the basics of this stuff. So I guess we'll try to keep it, give some reminders in there, but in order for us to have a new episode, we can't spend the whole time redoing episode 1.
So I think what I find interesting here is that, here we have another piece of historical evidence that perfectly fits within this theory, which is that World War II created a lot of public debt. And the post-World War II boom, in large, can be attributed to that relative to private debt, there was just a lot of public debt, a lot of liquidity, a lot of net private savings in the private sector. And that was a good basis to launch the post-World War II boom, basically. So then, moving on to page 80. Okay. So we've talked about the Kalicki equation before, but I want to get into this chapter in this section where he talks about Kalicki just so you have some more info on that. Adding the Kalecki investment profit relations. Even in his early work, Minsky recognized that desires to raise leverage and move to more speculative positions could be frustrated. If results turn out to be more favorable than expected, an attempt to engage in speculative finance could remain a hedge position because actually I need to explain what hedge and speculative means.
Yeah, I was gonna say, man, I got to start writing down all these vocab words to print out after a year because I don't even know what they mean.
Got it. No. Right. Okay, here we go. This is the part I was missing. And this is great. This is really important. Minsky created a famous distinction among three financing profiles to account for the margins of safety. The safest is called hedge, where prospective income flows are expected to cover all interest and principal payments. Okay, so an example here would be, just to interject,
yes, please.
You build a plant and you borrow $100,000 to build a plant, and you have to pay 5% interest. Let's say 5% interest, 5% principal every year. So you pay like $10,000 every year, and the plant produces, or the plant yields you a profit of $20,000, let's say, every year. So your prospective income flows are expected to cover all interest and principal payments in that case. You have planned everything perfectly, and you can serve your interest and your service your interest and your debt payments out of the profit that you generate. And then the next one, a riskier profile. So this was hedge. Okay, a riskier.
Yeah, and then I'm sorry. Can you give the single sentence definition of hedge again?
Yeah, the safest is called hedge, where prospective income flows are expected to cover all interest and principal payments.
Got it. And that's, for example, when you said we're opening like a factory, we're actually making a physical thing and selling that physical thing, and the proceeds from doing that will cover all debt service that we need to cover.
A risk
plus a profit.
A riskier profile is called speculative, where near-term income flows cover only interest, so that principal cannot be covered, but it is expected that income will eventually rise sufficiently to pay down principal. So similar example of what I just gave you, except let's say we only make $5,000 a year on that plant. And so we can only cover the interest, at least in the beginning. And we're hoping that over time, we're going to become so productive that we can start covering interest and principal payments. But go ahead. But near-term income flows will only be sufficient to cover interest payments.
What I wanted to say is I haven't actually done this yet, but in some real estate potential projects that I was looking at, negotiating for interest-only debt servicing was actually something on the table to approach the seller with. Because when you do all the math, particularly if it's a situation where the owner's financing the deal, or it's a rental situation where the cash flow has to make sense, and whether or not you pay $1,000 of principal on a debt service can actually make your deal cash flow or not. So that. I never realized someone like Minsky had actually broken these things down into categories. I just always felt that was a way to get into a deal.
Yeah.
But I see what you mean, that the idea is that at some point this is going to be making enough money that I could actually pay this principal
exactly.
down. But we're not going to worry about that for right now because we just want to get in, and it's enough to take care of the interest.
Yeah. So the first one was hedge, safest. Next one was speculative, less safe. And now finally, the riskiest one is called Ponzi, named named after Charles Ponzi, who ran a pyramid scheme. Today's counterpart would be Bernie Madoff, where near-term recipients, where near-term receipts are insufficient to cover even interest payments, so that debt increases as interest is capitalized into the principal. Essentially, a Ponzi unit is borrowing to pay interest. Unless interest rates fall or income flows rise, this is an unsustainable position.
I was wondering what was worse than speculative.
Yeah. So over the course of an expansion, the financial stance of firms and even households evolves from largely hedge to include ever-rising proportions of speculative and even Ponzi positions. The riskier financial structure is much more vulnerable to either a rise of interest rates or a shortfall of income.
Wait, so he's saying households will move from hedge to speculative to Ponzi? Does he give an example of what that might look like?
Well, he's saying firms and even households. But the example of a household would be one that borrows an interest-only loan, basically, to buy a house, for example.
Or I guess even extend that to even less necessary things like, okay, I'm going to do it on my truck and I'm going to get a trailer so I can haul my boat and then take my RV with me that I all got interest-only payments on, sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah, and then at one point, he can't even make the interest payments anymore. So he starts rolling it over and telling the bank, oh, wait, I'm going to pay this later. So that would be a household Ponzi.
Got it.
And so now we get to adding the Kalecki investment-profit relations. Even in his early work, Minsky recognized that desires to raise leverage and move to more speculative positions could be frustrated. If results turned out to be more favorable than expected, an attempt to engage in speculative finance could remain a hedge position because incomes realized turn out to be greater than anticipated. Thus, while Minsky did not incorporate the now well-known Kalecki relation, parentheses, in the simple model, investment determines aggregate profit, so that rising spending on capital assets actually increases the flow of income to firms, end parentheses, he did recognize that an investment boom could raise aggregate demand and spending through the Keynesian spending multiplier, and thus generate more sales than projected. Indeed, in his view, that made the dynamics even worse. If the expectations of borrowing firms about profits were systematically exceeded, they would make increasingly crazy bets, generating a runaway speculative boom. Later, he explicitly incorporated the Kaleckian result that in the simplest model, aggregate profits equal investment plus the government deficit. Thus, in an investment boom, profits would be increasing along with investment, helping to validate expectations and encouraging even more investment. This result added weight to his proposition that the fundamental instability in the capitalist economy is upward, towards a speculative frenzy. Furthermore, since the government's budget deficit would grow in a downturn, this growth would help prop up profits, reducing downside risks, as discussed earlier. In addition, in the early 1960s, he argued that effects on private sector balance sheet would depend on the stance of the government's balance sheet. A government spending-led expansion would allow the private sector to expand without creating fragile balance sheets. Indeed, government deficits would boost profits and add safe treasury debt to private portfolios. However, a robust private sector-led expansion would tend to cause tax revenues to grow faster than private sector income, with a progressive tax system and with transfer spending falling in a boom, so that the government budget would, in quotes, improve towards more surplus, while the private sector balance would deteriorate towards deficit. For that reason, Minsky argued that private sector-led expansions tend to be more unsustainable than government-led expansions. Because private deficits and debt are more dangerous than government deficits and debt. So that's something we've also discussed over and over, that to have stable growth, there needs to be a certain degree of safe assets, and those are the treasury assets. And they kind of necessitate a government deficit or export surplus, which means there's some other government doing deficit spending for you. And that was, yeah, I think that's all on Kaliki. So moving on to page 84. 84, he talks a little bit about the failures of monetarism. So,
and what's the definition of monetarism again?
Monetarism was basically Milton Friedman's school, and sort of the belief that the Fed needs to manage the growth of the money supply and make sure it's stable, and that way produce stable growth, etc. So,
but does the Fed even have the ability to do that?
Well, that's exactly what we'll get into now.
Got it.
Minsky continued to improve his approach to banks, recognizing the futility of Fed attempts to control the money supply. He argued that whereas the Fed had been created to act as a lender of last resort, making business debts more liquid, the Fed no longer relied on the discount window. Indeed, most reserves supplied by the Fed come through open market operations, buying government bonds, which greatly restricts the Fed's ability to ensure safety and soundness of the system by deciding which collateral to accept. The Fed no longer had the opportunity to take a close look at balance sheets of borrowing banks, or to assess ability to generate cash flows to cover expenses. Instead, the Fed had come to rely on Friedman's simplistic monetarist view that the primary role of the Fed is to control the money supply by restricting the supply of reserves created in open market purchases. In Friedman's view, this view allows the Fed to control the economy as a whole simply by controlling the creation of money by banks.
Sorry, quick interruption. This is the idea that banks are limited by by the interest rate determined by the Fed,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Okay, and then go again. Reference to earlier episodes, we break down in detail why the reserve rate set by the Fed has very little to nothing to do with the amount of credit expansion available to the banks.
Yeah. In Minsky's view, the central bank really cannot control the money supply. The problem is that attempts to constrain reserves only induce bank innovations that ultimately require lender of last resort interventions and even bailouts that validate riskier practices. Together with counter-cyclical deficits to maintain demand, this approach not only prevents deep recession, but also creates chronic inflation bias. To fight inflation, fiscal policy would be skewed towards austerity, while monetary policy would maintain high interest rates. All of this came to a head at the end of the 1970s, when the economy was suffering from stagflation, high unemployment, and high inflation at the same time. Fed Chairman Paul Volcker announced a plan to implement a strict version of monetarism, an experiment that consisted of extremely high interest rates to fight the inflation, with an announced money growth rule so that no one would be surprised. This was supposed to eliminate price pressures without causing unemployment through fooling, discussed earlier, the idea that no one would be fooled if the policy was widely known. It didn't work. The United States went into the deepest recession at the time since the Great Depression. The policy also devastated the entire US thrift sector, the savings and loan system, because thrifts were stuck with relatively low interest fixed rate mortgage loans, but had to pay high interest rates on their own shorter term liabilities. A severe financial crisis added to the nation's woes. In Minsky's view, this crisis created unnecessary suffering and also showed that the monetarist theory and policy were flawed. The lesson to be learned was that the central bank cannot control the money supply and that money growth by itself is not a good predictor of either income growth or inflation.
That last part always gets me. That the money growth / the money supply doesn't really tell us much.
Exactly.
Right? It's I think you mentioned it this way before, which is it's kind of an after effect.
Exactly.
It's like after other stuff happens, then the result is something happens to the supply of money. It's not the other way around.
Exactly. Yeah, the money supply is not causal to anything. What's causal is bank lending and government deficits and stuff like that. They can have positive or negative impacts. So, moving on to
also to get. Sorry, I just wanted to give another frame of reference. When you were reading about the high interest rates, what was it back in the late 70s?
Yeah, it went as
was this when they went up to like 12%?
Oh, they went up
or something like that.
Something like 20%. I think 18 to 20%.
Holy crap!
Yeah, on your savings account you could get 18%. It's not bad, huh?
Yeah, until you got a mortgage.
Exactly. So, moving on to page 89. What do banks do? Okay, this is interesting because it sort of discusses on a higher level what do banks do? Why do we have banks? We begin with Minsky's approach to the nature of banking. What is it that banks do? Minsky always argued that anyone can create money, but the problem lies in getting it accepted. He insisted that banking is not money lending. A money lender must first obtain money before making a loan. Whereas most people think that banks sit around and wait for deposits to flow in so that they can make loans, Minsky argued that is the moneylender's business, not the banking business. Banks instead create money as they make loans. That makes a big difference. Let us see how that works. But before proceeding, look at it this way. A bank deposit is the IOU of the bank, showing up on the liability side of the bank's balance sheet. Banks have trillions and trillions of dollars of these IOUs on their balance sheets. In the United States, we have 2 banks, each of which alone has issued 2 trillion in IOUs, and several others are not that much smaller. The IOUs are contingent liabilities in the sense that the bank's creditors can insist on payment or conversion to cash either on demand deposit, or after some waiting period, time deposit. Minsky said that where most people go wrong is that they think banks operate like money lenders who stand on street corners in Chicago, taking in deposits of currency and then lending them out at a higher usurious. Is it usurious? Usury?
Usurious? I don't know. I've heard it so few times in my life. I couldn't tell you. Yeah. Is there an extra I in the end there? Usurious.
Yeah.
Okay, usurious. There you go.
Usurious. Interest rate. Banks supposedly then hold some of the deposited cash as reserves to meet withdrawal of deposits. Since the Fed limits the quantity of cash, bank lending is limited. But how could that be so? In the first place, the math won't work. The total amount of cash in existence is less than $1 trillion. And estimates put well over half of that outside the United States, while much of the total is used to evade taxes and to finance illegal activities in black markets such as gun running and drug smuggling. So only a small fraction of the total cash is available for banks to receive in deposits in order to make loans. And yet they've got trillions and trillions of loans on their balance sheets and have issued just as many IOUs, including deposits. Think about the last time you went to a bank. Did you take a wheelbarrow of cash in for deposit so that your friendly banker could make some mortgage loans? Actually, what we see is that most people go to the bank to take cash out. Banks mostly supply cash. They do not wait around to receive it in order to make loans. So how do things really work? Whenever banks need cash to meet withdrawal, they do not turn to depositors. Rather, they call up the Fed. The Fed trucks cash to the banks to stock the automatic teller machines, ATMs. In turn, the Fed debits bank reserves held at the Fed. These are just the private banking system's checking account held at the Fed.
So the Fed, sorry to interrupt again, just want to make sure I understand that correctly. So the bank has reserves that it owns deposited at its bank, which is the Federal Reserve. And let's say it's got $1 million in there, and I walk in and I'm like, hey, I want $10,000 in cash, and they don't have it in hand. They call the Federal Reserve and say, hey, we need $10,000 in cash trucked over. They subtract $10,000 from the $1 million that they have in the bank's bank account at the Federal Reserve, and they print the cash out of nothing. This is the firing up of the printing presses, and then they send it to the banks where they can give it to me.
Exactly. So the bank's reserve accounts at the Fed are basically the bank's checking accounts at the Fed, where we have checking accounts at private banks. Private banks have checking accounts at the Fed, and those are called reserve accounts. Over time, the outstanding amount of cash, including that held outside the US, tends to grow on trend because banks pay out more cash than they receive. All US dollars, cash, in existence were paid out by banks at the teller windows or ATMs. At the teller's windows or ATMs. What if a bank is short reserves? Will the Fed refuse to send the cash? No. The Fed lends reserves to cover the cash needs. Otherwise, the banks would have to close its doors, refusing to meet demands for cash, which would scare other depositors and lead to runs on banks. Except for occasional hiccups, you do not find the ATMs shut down or bank doors closed because of cash shortages. Indeed, all money and banking textbooks insist that the non-bank public determines the supply of cash. Since banks promise to supply it on demand, the Fed provides banks with all they need to meet withdrawals. It is the Fed that brings the wheelbarrows of cash to the banks, not depositors. And the Fed supplies cash not so that banks can make loans. Rather, the cash is to cover withdrawals from deposits. When the Fed sends cash to banks, it debits their reserve account at the Fed, which is essentially the bank's demand deposit account. Where did the banks get those deposits? From Fed keystrokes to their accounts. Where does the Fed get the reserves it credits to bank checking accounts at the Fed? It creates them out of thin air, either by printing notes or mostly through keystrokes that credit bank reserves. In fact, the vast majority of bank reserves are nothing but electronic entries. Reserves are always entered on two balance sheets, first as the liability of the central bank, and second as the asset of the bank receiving the credit. Where does the Fed get the banknotes it trucks to the ATMs? Also out of thin airs. Keystrokes instruct the printing press at the US Treasury to print more. If banks do not have the reserves to debit when the Fed sends them banknotes, the Fed lends reserves and records an entry, borrowed reserves, as the Fed's asset and the bank's liability. Again, this is keystrokes. We can also ask, where do banks get the deposits they credit to the accounts of their customers? Again, they create them out of
nowhere.
What was it?
They create out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Just
again, they create them out of thin air. The deposit is entered on the bank's balance sheet as a liability and on the customer's balance sheet as an asset. Is there a pattern? Money is always created out of thin air. Except for actual cash, money exists only as an entry on a balance sheet. Actually, two entries: the IOU of the issuer and the asset of the creditor. In the case of cash, it is an asset of the holder, whether a bank or an individual, and a liability of the issuer, treasury coins or Federal Reserve notes. The cash is really just a record of the liability that happens to be printed on metal or paper, unlike the keystroke entry that is an electronic record. So most people, including Krugman and many other economists, have the banking business all wrong. Whenever you make deposits into banks, they are usually deposits of bank IOUs. There is a check drawn on another bank or an electronic deposit, which is also a claim on another bank. It is mostly all about bank money. Where did it come from? From banks. Where did they get it? They created it. How? They mostly created deposits through keystroke credits to accounts. This is not as mysterious as it first seems. Say that you write an IOU to your neighbor. I owe you $5. It is your financial liability and your neighbor's financial asset. Where did it come from? Thin air. You might record it on paper or wood or a chalkboard or in a computer file. Memories are faulty and may not be accepted in evidence should you need to go to court. You can think of the method of recording the IOU as determined by law, tradition, and technology, but it does not change the nature of the monetary IOU. Did you have to get cash first to write the IOU? No. Do you have $5 in cash in your pocket to write the IOU? No. While having cash on hand or easy access to cash might enhance the acceptability of your IOU, you can write IOUs without it. You do have to redeem your debt at some point. Your neighbor presents your IOU to you for your redemption, and you must come up with the cash, or you write a check on your bank deposit, or you provide something else of value that is mutually acceptable. When you satisfactorily redeem yourself, your neighbor hands back your IOU and you tear it up. In this process, you created money out of thin air. The money was your IOU denominated in dollars. The money you created is destroyed when you repay your debt. This is what Minsky means when he says anyone can create money. One might object, but how can that be money? It was just my debt held by my neighbor. It didn't circulate. The neighbor could not buy anything with it. Yes, all of that could be true. On the other hand, it is conceivable that you are well known and trusted across your entire neighborhood. In that case, the neighbor holding your IOU might be able to pass it in redemption of her own IOU to another neighbor, a third party. In that case, this other neighbor can present it to you for redemption, or your neighbor might hire a local kid to mow the lawn, and then the kid presents it to you for redemption. So at least in theory, your IOU could circulate to pay debts or to buy services, if your neighbors deemed it acceptable. As Minsky always said, anyone can create money, but the problem lies in getting it accepted. Both banks and money market mutual funds create money in the sense that they issue money-denominated liabilities. Both have to get them accepted. Banks are more special than other financial institutions because government gives them special protection. When times are good, this might not matter much. The money created by other types of financial institutions is just about as good as the deposits created by banks. In bad times, that reverses, and the liabilities created by shadow banks are about as desired as a fork in the eye. PIMCO's Paul McCulley put it this way shortly after the shadow banks crashed in 2008. Over the last 3 decades or so, the growth of banking outside formal, sovereign regulated banking has exploded. And it was a great gig so long as the public bought the notion that such funding instruments were just as good as bank deposits. Keynes proves the essential and existential answer as to why the shadow banking system became so large, the unraveling of which lies at the root of the current global financial system crisis. It was a belief in a convention, undergirded by the length of the time that belief held. Shadow bank liabilities were viewed just as good as conventional bank deposits, not because they are, but because they had been. Maybe, just maybe, there was and is something special about a real bank as opposed to a shadow bank. And indeed, that is unambiguously the case, as evidenced by the ongoing partial re-intermediation of the shadow banking system back into the sovereign-supported conventional banking system, as well as the mad scramble by remaining shadow banks to convert themselves into conventional banks so as to eat at the same sovereign-subsidized capital and liquidity cafeteria as their former stodgy brethren. And I want to just yeah, that was
I was gonna say let's unpack that a little bit, please.
Yeah,
that was a lot.
So
What's a shadow bank?
A shadow bank is any institution that can lend money or invest money without being under banking regulation, sort of circumventing the banking regulation regime. And so, to be more concrete, shadow banks today are pension funds, hedge funds, university endowments, basically big money groups that have a lot of money at their disposal that they can lend out, and also money market mutual funds.
So essentially, I'm still tripping over the shadow banks here. So a shadow bank, if we say, it's like a big pension fund or a hedge fund or something, it's an entity or an institution that has somehow acquired other people's money in large amounts, kind of like a glorified version of the money lender on the street corner of Chicago.
Yes, exactly.
And so they've started doing crazy financial instruments that may or may not have exceeded the actual amount of money that they have, sitting in their vaults, but they don't have the same money creation power as an actual bank does.
Yeah.
So what happens is when they get overextend themselves, they wind themselves up into a bunch of trouble, in addition to the fact that because they're not actually banks in the legal sense, they don't have to follow banking rules in the legal sense, so they maybe do some things that are more speculative or more Ponzi.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of it, you said once they wrap themselves in a tizzy, they run to the government and ask to have the normal banking rules applied to them. So they don't have to be responsible for the consequences that they created.
Exactly. They don't want to be.
Do I have that right?
Become regulated banks in hindsight, basically. And also to tie it back in the permanent portfolio that we talked about a little while ago, in the permanent portfolio, your cash portion should always be in money market mutual funds that only invest in treasury securities. Because when times are good, people put their money in money market funds that pay more interest than those simple funds. But then precisely when you need the cash, they actually underperform. And in fact, it has in 2007, 2008, what nobody thought possible had happened, that some of these money market mutual funds that invested in commercial paper and other private debt broke the buck, and the value per share dropped under $1, which is never supposed to happen to your cash equivalents. But it didn't happen to the treasury only money market mutual funds. And also, the other stuff was mostly just about the process of creating an IOU, which is, we also covered that before. It's basically the credit theory of money, where anyone can create an IOU, but if you're Henry the shoemaker, then your IOUs might not be worth as much as if you're King Henry the First of Great Britain,
who can demand a tax.
Exactly. But that does not make shadow banks or commercial banks mere intermediaries that take in deposits and lend them out. Both finance positions and assets by issuing liabilities. Their liabilities are variously called deposits or now accounts or money market mutual fund shares. Ultimately, however, only insured deposits are guaranteed to never break the buck. For that reason, banks are special. This has nothing to do with them being money creators versus intermediaries. It has to do with sovereign government backing. If a bank suffers...
This is FDIC insurance, right?
Exactly.
Sorry to interrupt you in the middle of the reading. Okay.
If a bank suffers a clearing drain to other banks, it goes to the Fed funds market to borrow reserves or to the Fed's discount window. If it suffers a cash drain to withdrawals through the ATM, the Fed sends an armored truck to replenish cash and debits the bank's reserves. I think it's FDIC, but it's also access to the interbank lending market. What we are getting at is that the degree of moneyness. Minsky made no claim that your IOU is as good as a bank's IOU. Clearly, that is not the case. Banks are special, except for a government's own currency. Nothing fulfills money's functions as well as bank deposit IOUs. Yet, the dividing lines have always been blurred and are much more fluid today with all the innovations by banks and shadow banks. For example, except in crisis, money market mutual funds issued by shadow banks are almost equivalent to bank deposits. The holder can write checks on money market mutual funds, and until the 2007 crisis, no money market mutual fund had broken the buck. In parentheses, the value of a credit in an MMMF, a money market mutual fund, had never previously fallen below parity. In crisis, however, the government backstop provided to banks in the form of FDIC insurance and Fed lender of last resort promises makes bank IOUs much safer than shadow bank IOUs. When the crisis hit, the MMMF's institutions faced runs by their creditors, who feared that the buck would be broken. The run was stopped only by temporary extension of the US government's guarantee to include these shadow banks. So unless you have Uncle Sam standing behind you, your IOUs will be less liquid and thus inferior money in comparison to bank deposits. To be sure, there are other reasons banks are special, including their specialization in underwriting, determining creditworthiness, although underwriting standards fell considerably in the speculative boom of the mid-2000s, a topic for a later chapter. As usual, Minsky was ahead of his time. What he was advancing in the late 1950s was the view that money is endogenously created by banks. This was a reaction of the simple monetarist view that the central bank exogenously controls money creation through its control over the quantity of bank reserves. This also meant that Minsky rejected the simplistic deposit multiplier view still presented in textbooks. Instead, Minsky argued, if a bank is approached by a good customer, it makes a loan by creating a demand deposit. If the bank later needs reserves, it will borrow them in the Fed funds market or at the discount window. Haven't we been talking about that a lot?
Yeah. Go back to our previous episodes and you'll hear that over and over and over again.
Exactly. So, I think that's enough for that part.
Yeah, we're
almost an hour into this now. So, and as I told you earlier, I got my face smashed in during sparring this morning, so I'm operating on a major headache here. But
yeah, I guess Nima decided kissing the ground was a good idea.
Yeah,
you told me you weren't able to tuck and roll properly, and you just kind of do that. I've done it before in my own training, where you get thrown and somehow the roll instinct doesn't kick in, and you just kind of do this face plant.
Yeah.
Right in the mat.
I thought I had a really nice choke there, and then my partner threw me over his back, and I sort of just beautifully face planted into the mat instead of just tucking and rolling, which I should have done, but I didn't. So I've been dealing with that all day. But we've gotten an hour into this, so I think it's enough for banking, Minsky's views on banking. And next episode, we will probably get back into Carol Quigley, but in one of the upcoming episodes, we will be jumping back into Minsky, continuing where we left off.
Excellent.
Yes. So, unless you have anything else to add, Dylan,
take it away, Nima.
This has been Amagi, hosted by myself, Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And of course, we are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.